Raging Tempest is quite the menagerie when it comes to cards with support for existing archetypes as well as the release of new archetypes. One group of cards that seems to straddle the line between new archetype or support for an existing archetype are the Shinobirds or Esprit monsters. Are they going to be a new archetype, or are they just further support for the quote-unquote spirit archetype? This issue will only truly be answered in the future, but can these new Shinobird cards be used now to compete in the existing meta? Let's find out. Looking at the Shinobird direct support first, Shinobird Crane is not impressive. The lack of being able to special summon it puts pressure on either spirits that can actually be special summoned, like the Shino Ritual cards, or a card like Yamato-no-Kami to receive its draw effect, or you have to summon it via the effects of the Shino Ritual monster, so you can sidestep its no special summons and return effects. One of the biggest problems with Crane, though, is that you commonly have to use your normal summons to set it up, either through a Manju to get the ritual pieces to summon it via one of your ritual monster's effects, or Aratama to search for the Crane itself to put it in your hand so that you can put it on the field with Baron's effect. Fortunately, Baroness obviously sidesteps the Aratama search issue. Its overall effect activation consistency, though, is rather poor. Also, with the once per turn condition on its effect, the typical one-turn waiting game really limits the effectiveness of the draw effect. Also, its mediocre stats disallow its ability to really hold the field, so typically the most you're really going to get is that single draw. Obviously, you can get a second normal summons to try to aid this effect through Seraph Knight or Mike, but I think running either of those cards in this deck just promotes overall inefficiency and is a mistake. I feel Crane would have been better if it had an effect you could activate rather than this continuous I have to be on the field effect, where its activated effect could be once per turn. If you control another spirit monster, draw one card. Something simple like that would have made Crane really useful. As its effect stands now, though, as mentioned, Crane is very inefficient and not useful. Overall, unless you plan to run a devout spirit deck with the rituals, with no other hybrid or any other type of engine, Crane really is not worth the trouble. Shinobird Pigeon is rather bad because spirits already have a built-in return effect when normal summoned, which will comprise 90+% of their summons. I guess this card is supposed to be maybe comboed with Hebo, Lord of the River, another new spirit monster arriving in Tempest that's not part of the Shinobird archetype, but since neither monster can be special summoned because both are spirits, the ability to combo both together is needlessly difficult for almost little benefit. This card could have been interesting and potentially useful in a spirit control deck of sorts if there was some benefit associated with the return. For example, if the return spirit was level 4 or lower, target and banish one card on the opponent's field. If the return monster was level 5 or 6, look at the opponent's hand and return one card to the opponent's deck. If the card was 7+, select one card in your graveyard and return it to your hand. Without any additional benefit, just, hey look, I'm bouncing a spirit monster which will more than likely already bounce itself back to the hand, this card is almost pointless. 0 copies. Shinobird Crow is not as bad as it might first seem, for it can easily become a 3000 level 4 attack monster that can get you out of some nasty situation, mostly when your special summoning is shut down by a Vanity's card, either Vanity's Emptiness or Vanity's Fiend. Also, it's a level 4 Winged Beast Wind monster, which does allow it to participate in numerous Quality XZ summons in combination with the summons effect associated with the 2 ritual monsters. Finally, Crow acts as an interesting attack stopper, for with a single discard it can jump from 0 to 3000 or 0 to 2500 or 0 to 2700 or 2800 if you want to run the higher level spirits. Its mere presence on the field can cause trepidation for the opponent. However, Crow is also somewhat slow and not a very good combo card. Overall, out of the existing non-ritual Shino support, Crow is probably the only one that could even be worth running for those interested. For me, though, I'm not interested. Shinobaron Peacock, I understand the name change, but not really sure why it was needed, is the better of the two boss Shino rituals because it provides non-target, non-position dependent bounce of up to 3 monsters, opening the door to massive damage if not an outright OTK victory. Understandably, this is not so great for pendulum-based decks, but for non-pendulum-based decks, it's fairly useful. If the opponent does not negate the effect, 90+% of the time the opponent will have a clear field after this card's effect resolved, resulting in at least 3,000 damage, plus whatever it summoned through effect, if anything, and whatever else was normal summoned during the turn. When the OTK cannot be achieved, Peacock returns to the hand but summons a pair of decent token blockers to protect your life points until your next turn. Overall, because this is a Shino build, I run 3 copies. Shinobaroness Peacock is weaker than Baron, both in attack power and general usefulness of her effect, but is still quality. The biggest problem, though, with her effect is a vast majority of the back row that exists in the meta right now is chainable, outside of the occasional Mirror Force variant. Therefore, spinning back row to the deck is really not that useful in most situations, for the opponent is either going to chain the back row, or Solemn Strike Baroness when she activates her effect. Where Baroness really shines, though, is where Baron has trouble, and that's against pendulum decks, spinning both pendulum scales back to the deck, in addition to one other card if so desired, leaving the opponent wondering about what their next move might be. The deck's summoning effect is rather nice, allowing combination potential with either Nikitama or Crane for more draws over the course of the turn. The sad side note for me, but maybe a very happy side note for others, this deck summons effect of Baroness basically closes the door on Yatagarasu ever being unbanned. Shinobird Calling is the obviously required ritual spell for the deck. All modern ritual spells seem to have some sort of shtick or additional effect associated with them to make the overall ritual archetype they support actually quality, and Calling's bonus effect is the ability to banish spirit monsters from the graveyard as tribute for the summons. This effect is actually rather nice, and works well with maximizing the resources for the deck, especially because you can utilize it with the ritual cards themselves. So if you have one sitting in the graveyard for whatever reason, there's your entire cost if you want to summon the other one or another copy. Not surprisingly, 3 copies are a must. Shinobird Power Spot is a card with potential, but due to existing circumstances, cannot fulfill it. The biggest problem with Power Spot is similar to what plagues most spell and trap support. It's not searchable. Therefore, it is difficult to take advantage of its continuous and potentially multi-use ability, for its acquisition is random and generally unplanned. And spirits are not, whether it's Shino or a non-Shino control build, are not the most consistent deck to begin with. The attack increase is nice, but generally meaningless due to the bounce aspect of Baron. For most of the time, it will not make the difference between the OTK and the opponent having 1,000 or less life points. Not surprisingly, the once per turn effect on its search effect does the card no favors with regards to running multiple copies. Overall, this card would have been so much better if the attack increase was foregone for a nice discard effect, like discard this card from your hand to the graveyard to add 1 level 4 or lower spirit monster from your deck to your hand. This effect could have helped ritual summoning, further searching, or crow effect without being overpowered because, well, we're talking about spirits here. Shinobird Salvation is not a bad defensive card, but it's also not a very efficient defensive card, especially in this deck. There are much better defensive cards in the game for this deck, like Mirror Force variants or Book of Eclipse for those who want to play defense. In some sense, this card is much better in a non-ritual based spirit deck over one running Baron and Baroness, largely because Baron's going to be typically removing a lot of the threats. So the first effect, oh wow, Baron just bounced back to my hand. Oh, but you don't have anything on your field to destroy. Well, that's kind of a waste. And as mentioned, the attack stopping aspect of its effect is underpowered relative to numerous other traps you could run to manage the restriction of your opponent attacking. Overall, when it comes to the Shinobird support, outside of the rituals, the rest of the support is hugely lacking. In addition, the general weakness of the existing spirit archetype does not lend itself to easy and effective incorporation of these cards into a spirit-centric deck. The sad thing about the first wave of Shino spell and trap support is that the card designers almost seem to be pushing players towards a control version of the deck when the ritual boss monsters, which don't really play well with a control version of the deck, and they're much better at dropping OTKs on the opponent. This deck is not supposed to peck away 1,000 to 1,500 damage per turn. It's supposed to drop 5,000 to 8,000 attack bombs. Overall, if Shinobirds are going to be their own archetype, this is a horrible start. So if the non-ritual cards in the Shinobird deck are, let's be nice here, less than conducive to competitive play, how does the deck build proceed? Well, in some respects, it can be argued that when there are holes in a ritual build, it makes some sense to insert some parts of the best ritual deck in the history of the game and one of the best decks ever in the game, period, Nekroz. Largely for protection purposes, I run 2 copies of Valkyrus, 1 copy of Unicore, 1 copy of Brionac, 1 copy of Clausolas, along with 2 copies of Kaleidoscope and 1 copy of Cycle. For the remainder of the monsters, I like running the obvious 3 copies of Manju of 10,000 Hands for searching, XZing, and tributing purposes. Also, I like running 3 copies of Nikitama as a general staple in this deck for tributing it from the hand for a successful Shino ritual summons nets a draw, and there are a number of XZ plays that can be utilized when you put it on the field after being summoned off a Shinobird Ritual, either from the hand via Baron or from the deck via Baroness, that can also net you the draw. I run 3 copies of SPYRAL Super Agent for its innate special summoning potential, as well as the ability to destroy back row and acquire information about the opponent's next draw. The nice thing about Super Agent in this deck is, even if you don't get its special summon effect, you still get information about your opponent's next draw, and you can still use it in the ritual summons, if so desired. Closing out the monsters, I run a series of 1-copy cards. 1 copy of Yamato-no-Kami to provide extra OTK finisher support, as well as pendulum scale destruction if it comes down to it. 1 copy of Electromagnetic Turtle serves a nice dual purpose, tribute fodder, and if something goes wrong, a 1-turn stall. 1 copy of Performage Trick Clown for XE playmaking, tribute fodder, and some level of field control, and 1 copy of Plaguespreader Zombie for synchro versatility, because Dimensional Barrier, it's a thing. Now, some viewers may look at the monster count and ask the question, where's Aratama? The biggest problem with Aratama in this deck is that while it is a +1, it only searches spirit monsters. Searching for either Baron or Baroness is typically not an issue for this deck, and since I really don't run any other spirits other than Nikitama, running him just for that +1 is rather inefficient in my mind. The consistency of this deck revolves around getting your hands on calling, which Aratama does not play a role. Basically, in my opinion, unless you're going full board spirit in a Shinobird Ritual deck, which I don't think is the best way to go about it, I would not run Aratama. For the remaining spell cards, I run 3 copies of Trade-In because speed is important for this deck, and Calling's Banish Tribute ability almost mitigates most of the possible detriment for discarding a Baron or Baroness via Trade-In. In some respects, Trade-In in this deck is a quasi-pot of greed. 3 copies of Pre-Preparation of Rites is another no-surprise card for this deck, as both Baron and Baroness are named in Calling's texts, so Rites is an important speed card. 2 copies of Instant Fusion to provide more tribute fodder, synchro material for Plaguespreader, and Norden summoning for XZ plays. 1 copy of Foolish Burial to take advantage of graveyard manipulation of Plaguespreader, Electromagnetic, Trick Clown, and sending a Baron or Baroness for Calling's Banish ability if needed. Finally, I run 1 copy of Raigeki for board clearance and dealing with potential negators, and 1 copy of Preparation of Rites for increased Nekroz utilization versatility. Despite some potential for certain traps like Shinobird Salvation, Icarus Attack because the Shino Ritual tokens are Winged Beast, or Urgent Ritual Art, I do not run any traps in this deck because I find they produce too much inefficiency. Regarding Urgent Ritual Art, Some may like the idea of this card because it can use the left behind tokens off a previous Baron or Baroness summons to produce play interruption. But the biggest problem I seem to find with Urgent Ritual art is the interruption does not help a lot, because the ritual monster is lost during the end phase of the opponent's turn, and most of the time, especially if it's turn 3 or beyond, the interruption is of limited value because Baron can just break the board during your turn instead. In my opinion, it's probably a better strategy simply to run Icarus Attack for interruption play purposes over Urgent Ritual art if that's your idea, because Icarus Attack has more versatility overall. For the extra deck, I run 1 copy of Elder Entity Norden, 1 copy of Darkfire Dragon, although this can really be any level 4 fusion that can be summoned out via instant fusion. If you prefer running Icarus Attack, Mavelius is probably the best choice. 1 Quasar for Kaleidoscope, 1 Leo, the Keeper of the Sacred Tree. If a Shino gets its effect negated, you can make Leo with Plaguespreader, which can be useful. Leo can also be used with Kaleidoscope. 1 Crystal Wing Synchro Dragon, 1 PSY-Framelord Omega, 1 Stardust Charge Warrior, 1 Blackwing Nothung, the Starlight. That 800 burn damage can sometimes be the difference between the opponent getting another turn and, let's move on to the next game. Herald of the Arclight for Kaleidoscope. Number S39 Utopia the Lightning, number S39 Utopia, 1 Castel, the Skyblaster Musketeer, 1 Gaga Samurai for, obviously this is more of an OTK-centric deck, so that double attack, 3800 total damage helps. 1 Abyss Dweller, and 1 Gaga Cowboy for that burn damage. In the end, the Shino archetype, or quasi-archetype, depending on how Konami's going to play this, outside of the rituals, it's basically worthless at the moment. Fortunately, the rituals are good enough that this deck can do some things in a reasonably competitive environment. However, the biggest problem with this deck should be glaringly obvious to everyone. It is very bad when going first, due to the spirit element, for while the tokens are nice, they do not typically provide much resistance for an opponent if your opponent opens well. The Nekroz elements significantly aid efficiency and provide additional first turn support, either with the ability to put Unicore on the field, or using Valk's battle negation ability, so it rolls back over to your turn, and now Baron and Baroness actually have targets when you put them on the field. In my experience, this deck is rather consistent and rather fast at getting the job done. It's just that pesky, they really can't do anything going first. Well, that's my Shinobird Ritual deck. Thank you for your attention and your time. I'm out.